Hey guys, welcome back to GX Story Sleeping. Tonight we dive into a world where your neighbor might accuse you of sorcery, and your survival could depend on how well you float. That's right. Tonight we're drifting back into the medieval ages, when laws didn't just bend logic. They body slammed it into a muddy ditch behind the village tavern. You lie there, drifting in a shallow stream, wrists bound to your ankles, and a small crowd of villagers watches eagerly from the banks. Some cheer, some pray. One's definitely eating a roasted onion on a stick. The local priest chants in Latin, the magistrate adjusts his feathered cap, and you're just hoping not to drown. Because if you sink, congratulations, you're innocent. You'll be dead, but innocent. If you float, witch. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing those pop up around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You bob on the surface a little too easily for comfort. There's no real science here, just superstition tied up with a religious fervor and a general lack of understanding about human buoyancy. The logic? Water is pure, holy even, so it naturally rejects the unholy. You know, like you. This little swim test, lovingly dubbed trial by water, was one of several bizarre legal procedures used to determine guilt or innocence. Forget evidence. Forget witnesses. The element itself, fire, water, iron, was the judge. In your case, it's a creek behind a goat shed. Some places even tied a rope around you, just in case you were innocent and needed to be dragged back out after sinking. How considerate. And yet, many didn't bother with the rope, because why waste good twine on a possible demon host? What's amazing is how widespread this method was. From England to the Holy Roman Empire, local courts swore by it. Clergy oversaw the dunkings, sometimes with prayers, sometimes with boiling accusations. And here's where the scholars start squabbling. Some argue the church didn't fully approve. Others claim they orchestrated the whole show. The line between spiritual ritual and civic execution? Muddy at best. Just like the stream you're currently flailing in. There's a documented case from 1324 in Kilkenny, Ireland, where a woman named Alice Keitler was accused of sorcery. She escaped, smart lady, but her servant Petronilla was not so lucky. She got the water test, followed by burning at the stake, just to be sure. Apparently, double tapping her with medieval justice seemed necessary. One fringe theory from medieval law scholars suggests the whole thing may have evolved from older pagan rituals, where water wasn't punishment but purification. But by the time we hit the Middle Ages, purification looked a lot like attempted murder with a side of moral panic. Also, in true medieval fashion, men and women didn't always get the same rules. Some regions used ordeal by cold water for women, and ordeal by hot water for men. The idea being, scalding is more manly? Again, the logic is floating away, downriver, probably past a sunken ox cart. Some towns even turned these trials into social events. Vendors would gather, food stalls popped up, and kids got to watch an accused witch flail about in a muddy pond while their parents nodded solemnly and passed moral judgment between bites of meat pie. The Middle Ages, where entertainment and execution went hand in hand. Eventually, the absurdity began to crack. In 1215, the church officially banned clergy from participating in ordeals, which helped tone things down a little. But trial by water lingered in some rural areas well into the 17th century. People clung to it like it was a medieval game show with deadly consequences. And yes, sometimes the accused did float, but not because they were witches. Bound limbs trap air, and the body naturally resists submersion when constrained. It's physics, not dark magic, unless you're a 14th century sheep herder, in which case, definitely dark magic. So here you are, gently bobbing, the water cool against your skin, the rope biting into your wrists. Your fate hangs not on truth nor reason, but on how convincingly you sink like a rock. You take one last breath, the crowd leans in, and somewhere in the back, someone mutters, "Knew she was a witch. She talks to her chickens." Your feet still ache from the stream, but now you're led to a village square where a new kind of judgment awaits. A thick crowd gathers. There's a hush, like everyone's waiting for a play to start, but there's no stage, just a row of glowing red plowshares lined up in the dirt, because clearly the only way to prove your innocence is to stroll barefoot over molten farming equipment. Welcome to Trial by Ordeal. Again. But this one's hotter. In this charming little tradition, you don't just walk across the irons. No. You then get your blistering feet wrapped up and locked away for a few days. After that, someone peels back the bandages and checks your burns. If they're healing nicely, congrats. You're innocent. If not, you're guilty. And also, probably infected. This was ordeal by fire, one of the more popular forms of medieval truth-seeking. The belief behind it was that divine power would intervene. God would protect the innocent from injury, or at least speed up their healing, which honestly seems like a weirdly delayed miracle. There were other hot options too. One variation had you plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone at the bottom. Don't worry, they gave you a few seconds. The blisters were just an afterthought. Mainstream historians often point to King Ethelred, the Unready's England in the 10th century, as a hotbed for fire-based ordeals. The idea was that commoners couldn't be trusted with the truth, but God had a very clear opinion, usually communicated via third-degree burns. But here's where things get extra spicy. Some scholars argue the real point of these ordeals wasn't about truth at all. Instead, they think it was psychological pressure. If someone agreed to the ordeal and got injured, people accepted the outcome. If they refused the ordeal, that counted as guilt too. It was like being asked, do you want to be punched in the face or called a liar? And realizing you can't win either way. And not every trial was physically painful. Sometimes the ordeal was symbolic, like holding a hot iron while reciting prayers. If you messed up the words or dropped the iron, oops, Satan clearly tripped you. Next stop, execution. You glance down at the plowshares. The metal glows faintly orange. You swear you can feel the heat in your teeth. A priest nearby mutters something in Latin, probably about mercy, and the village reeve gives a small nod. Time to walk. If your arches survive this, you'll go home a free person. If not, well, at least your ghost might get a cool legend. And now for your nightly weird tidbit. In some cases, women were allowed to opt out of fire ordeals if they had witnesses to their character, usually 12 other women who could vouch that she was definitely not, say, a serial adulteress or closet heretic. Basically, hey guys, she bakes a mean oatcake and only talks to her cat sometimes. Let's not burn her. These community-based versions were just as legally binding. Think of it like Yelp reviews, but for your eternal soul. As always, there was debate even back then. Some clergy and nobles quietly questioned the fairness of burning someone's hands and calling it God's will. There are records of bishops who hesitated, sometimes outright refusing to participate. But in many rural courts, the tradition was too embedded. People trusted fire more than lawyers. Honestly, who doesn't? Of course, like all medieval solutions, this one had practical flaws. Infection rates were high, results were inconsistent. Some accused survived, but were still condemned because a lord or magistrate didn't like the way they blinked during questioning. By the 13th century, especially after the church's 1215 crackdown on ordeals, these fiery tests began to cool down. Literally, they faded into folklore, replaced by more modern methods, like courtroom testimony and bribery. Still, the image lingers. A lone figure walking barefoot over burning steel, villagers whispering, priests praying, and the dull scent of scorched earth and bad decisions curling through the air. It's not justice as we know it. It's more like a medieval talent show where the prize is survival, and the judges are invisible deities with questionable interest in legal nuance. You take a deep breath, you step forward. 1, 2, 3, and hope that divine intervention has excellent timing. The stench of scorched flesh still lingers in your nose as you shuffle away from the ordeal square. But don't get too comfortable. There's another courtroom waiting. Only this one smells suspiciously like wet hay and pig. You look around and, yes, that is a pig in a tiny holding pen, staring you down with beady little eyes and a slightly smug expression. No, you haven't lost your mind. This pig is literally on trial. Welcome to one of the strangest quirks of medieval law, animal trials. And we're not just talking about chasing a rabid dog out of town. We mean full-blown robes and scrolls. All rise for the Honorable Lord Justice level trials for animals. That pig over there? She was caught attacking a toddler. And since that's considered murder in this feudal village, she's about to get the whole justice experience. Legal counsel, public hearing, and possibly even an executioner. It sounds absurd, but this wasn't rare. Between the 13th and 18th centuries, dozens, possibly hundreds of documented cases show animals being arrested, tried, and sentenced just like people. Pigs, cows, goats, horses, even the occasional rooster. Why? Because medieval folks believed in the moral order of the universe. If an animal committed a crime, it was an affront to divine law as much as human. One infamous case took place in Falaise, France in 1386. A sow was found guilty of mauling a child and was sentenced to death. But wait, she wasn't just executed. She was dressed in a human waistcoat and breeches, paraded through the town square, and then hanged from a gallows. Because if you're going to serve justice, it needs a theatrical flair, apparently. And here's where it gets even more delightfully deranged. The pig had a lawyer, a real one, paid by the town. There were actually medieval attorneys who specialized in defending animals. Their job was to argue that maybe the cow was provoked, or perhaps the donkey was acting in self-defense. Not quite Law and Order Barnyard Unit, but close. Fringe theorists suggest this wasn't just about law. It was symbolic. Trials showed that the entire community, from man to beast, was subject to a divine moral code. Punishing a misbehaving pig wasn't about the pig. It was about cosmic balance. Still, you'd think a firm, bad pig and stronger fencing might have sufficed. Now, scholars disagree on whether the public actually believed animals had guilt in the human sense, or if this was more of a spectacle, part ceremony, part cautionary tale. Some historians argue these trials were meant to show the strength of the legal system, even over the unpredictable forces of nature. Others think towns just really needed to spice up their monthly calendar. Either way, these weren't always cut and dry cases. Some animals were acquitted, others were exiled, yes, banished. Imagine tying a note around a goat's neck that says, "No longer welcome," and giving it a stern shove across the village border. Even insects got caught in the crosshairs. There are cases where swarms of locusts or weevils were excommunicated by church courts. Priests would conduct full ceremonies, complete with holy water, telling the bugs to leave or face divine wrath. Presumably, the weevils were unimpressed. One 16th century case in Switzerland involved a group of townsfolk suing a colony of rats for destroying crops. When the rats didn't show up to court, how rude. The defense argued that the journey was dangerous and that the rats had every right to fear for their safety. The judge postponed the trial to give them more time. Yes, really. And that wasn't even unusual. You stare at the pig again. She's lounging now, probably unaware of her impending doom or the fact that a human being is furiously scribbling down her confession. The crowd watches solemnly. A child drops a turnip. A local magistrate adjusts his wig. It's absurd. It's theatrical. But to the medieval mind, it made perfect sense. Justice, after all, was meant to be seen. And if that meant hanging a goose in public to make a point, so be it. You take a few steps back as the judge begins reading the charges. "Willful murder," he intones. The pig snorts, completely unbothered. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows, as if reminding everyone that his trial's next. The pig's trial ends with a squeal and a rope. Justice served, apparently. But just as you're pondering how many barnyard animals have criminal records, you hear something even more chilling than pig-snorting jurisprudence. A bell tolls slow and heavy, and someone whispers, "They've declared him outlaw." You turn, and the villagers are watching a man stumble away from town, barefoot and pale. No one speaks to him. No one stops him. And no one will help him again. Not ever. Because once you're declared an outlaw in medieval society, you're not just in trouble. You're legally dead. Outlawry was the court's way of saying, "We're done with you." If you skipped your trial, refused a summons, or just annoyed the wrong baron one too many times, the court could declare you an outlaw. literally outside the protection of the law. That meant anyone could kill you. Anyone. Without punishment. In fact, some were encouraged to. You feel a shiver despite the sun. This wasn't exile. It was open season. The idea goes back to Anglo-Saxon England, maybe earlier. But by the 12th century, outlawry was an established part of the legal toolkit. It was especially popular in cases where someone disappeared or couldn't be arrested in time. Rather than chase them across the hills forever, the court just erased their legal existence. Like medieval ghosting, but with swords. Of course, this wasn't the kind of thing you bounce back from. Once declared outlaw, you couldn't testify in court, couldn't own property, couldn't even be buried in a churchyard if you died. That's right, your soul got evicted too. One mainstream example is the case of Robin Hood. Yes, him. Whether or not he was real, the legend centers on his outlaw status. He's not just a bandit, he's someone denied legal rights entirely, surviving by wit, bow, and a suspicious amount of merry men. But not every outlaw got to become a folk hero. Most just ran, or hid, or got quietly stabbed behind a pub. In Norway and Iceland, outlawry was taken to even more dramatic heights. In Iceland's medieval law code, Gragas, full outlawry, called Skagangur, literally forest walking, meant permanent expulsion from society. No one could give you food, shelter, or even a bowl of soup. Helping an outlaw could get you outlawed. A slippery slope if you had a generous grandma. Here's a lesser-known tidbit. Some people voluntarily chose outlawry. Yep, in rare cases, especially during property disputes or inheritance squabbles, someone might opt for being declared outlaw to remove themselves from the legal chaos, sort of like rage-quitting society. Modern scholars debate whether outlawry was more symbolic than enforced. Some think it was used more as a scare tactic. Others argue it was ruthlessly applied, especially during times of political unrest or famine, when clearing out undesirables became more appealing. As usual, medieval records are a confusing blend of legalese, dramatic flair, and illegible Latin scribbles. Still, there were occasional escape hatches. If an outlaw could get to a church and claim sanctuary before being captured, they might get a second chance, or at least a delay. But you only got 40 days. After that, if you didn't agree to leave the kingdom forever, the hangman got your address. You watch the man trudge into the woods. He doesn't look back. No one offers food or farewell. A child clutches her mother's hand, and an older man mutters, "He shouldn't have missed his trial." Somewhere in the trees, crows caw as if they've been waiting for him. Justice here isn't just blind, it's savage. No appeals, no paperwork, no dramatic speeches to sway the jury, just a cold declaration that you no longer matter. Legally speaking, you've been erased. Personally, you're still breathing for now. But every step into the forest means one less chance of coming back. You follow the outlaw's trail for a bit, the trees swallowing him whole like a story no one wants to finish. But not all medieval punishment happens in the wild. In fact, most of it happens front and center, right in the middle of town, where everyone can watch you suffer over a nice bread and onion lunch. Because if there's one thing medieval justice loved, it was a little public humiliation. Welcome to the world of shaming punishments. Stocks, pillories, and cages. Every town had their own flavor. And no, these weren't cozy timeouts. You were locked in a wooden frame, usually by your neck and hands. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And while you stood there drooling with your arms asleep, the townsfolk got creative. Rotten vegetables? Classic. Mud pies to the face? Standard. Dead fish? A bold, but not unheard of choice. One woman in 14th century London was reportedly pelted with dung and eel skins for scolding her neighbor too loudly. So, not exactly a fair and balanced system, unless you're into compost-based justice. But here's the thing. Stocks and pillories weren't necessarily about cruelty. They were about shame. The idea was that public exposure would be a better deterrent than private punishment. A thief locked up for 2 hours while children laugh and throw onions might be more embarrassed than a thief quietly fined behind closed doors. Mainstream historians agree that these punishments were wildly popular from the 13th through 16th centuries, especially in towns where local courts wanted a hands-on approach. Literally. Because while you were stuck in there, people had permission to handle you. Now, for a slightly more bizarre angle, some people enjoyed these punishments, if only for the drama. Fringe accounts tell of minor offenders who turned their time in the pillory into street performances. One man in Norwich apparently sang tavern songs and made jokes while being pelted, winning the crowd over so effectively that they stopped throwing things and started tipping him in pennies. Another lesser-known variant was the cucking stool, used mostly for women accused of gossip, witchcraft, or being too loud, which honestly feels suspiciously subjective. The stool was often mounted on a long wooden beam and dunked in a river. It was a humiliating bath with zero spa benefits, wet, freezing, and surrounded by people cheering like they're at a football match. Because why deal with conflict when you can just soak someone until they stop arguing? And then there's the drunkard's cloak. This little fashion statement was a barrel, hollowed out and worn like a tunic. Offenders, usually men who drank too much ale and started yelling about the price of eggs, were forced to parade through the streets wearing it. Imagine being forced into a portable shame tank, while people chant rhymes about your drinking habits, but these punishments weren't all just random cruelty. Some legal scholars suggest they actually worked. Petty crime recidivism went down in towns where public humiliation was used effectively. Of course, that depends on your definition of effective, and whether you think being pelted with leeks at noon is a healthy way to reform behavior. Others argue that these public rituals created more problems than they solved. There's a historical debate around whether repeated public shame just hardened criminals, or worse, turned them into folk heroes. Because let's be honest, if you manage to juggle cabbages while locked in the pillory, someone's going to remember that more than your petty theft. You pass a pillory still standing in the village square, empty now, but stained from years of use, the wood splintered, a faint sour smell, probably turnips. You imagine being stuck there as a crowd gathers, not angry necessarily, just bored, looking for spectacle. You're not a person anymore. You're the town's weekend entertainment, and all because you stole 3 eggs, or maybe insulted the Reeves' new hat. In the end, still didn't really matter, because once your head went in, the law considered its job done. No trial transcript, no jury deliberation, just you, the weather, and an endless supply of rotting vegetables. Your thoughts drift as you walk past the splintered pillory, but you don't get far before the smell hits you. Not rotting vegetables this time. Something sharper, more pungent, a sour blend of sweat, urine, and regret. And just beyond the town gates, you spot the source. A wide, shallow pit surrounded by wooden stakes, buzzing with flies. The medieval prison. Now you might picture a stone fortress with barred cells and clanging keys, but hold that thought. That image is centuries too generous. In most of medieval Europe, prisons weren't for doing time. They were for waiting. Waiting for your trial. Waiting for someone to pay your fine. Waiting for execution. Basically, the worst holding pattern imaginable. The pit is dark and crowded, dug right into the earth. Prisoners huddle inside, limbs tangled, clothes soaked through. There's no separation. Murderers next to debtors, political rebels next to pickpockets. Rich and poor alike. Though, let's be honest, mostly poor. Mainstream historians agree that long-term imprisonment wasn't a common punishment back then. It was expensive, logistically difficult, and kind of pointless in a system where swift, visible penalties were preferred. Why feed someone for 5 years when you can just find them, flog them, or chop something off? That's why medieval jails were often run by private individuals. The local lord or sheriff might rent out part of his house. Monasteries had their own detention chambers, usually more focused on spiritual correction than comfort. And cities? They had jails. Early public prisons, often funded by the church or town council. But don't imagine cells with cots and bars. More like stone closets with straw and rats. Speaking of rats, yes, they're here. Lots of them. Skittering through the straw, sniffing the edges of crust that someone probably bribed a guard to throw in. Because here's a fun fact. In many prisons, you had to pay rent for your own confinement. No joke. Prisoners paid jail fees for bedding, food, even chains. Couldn't afford it? You just rotted. Literally. There are stories of men starving in corners while wealthier inmates played dice and drank watered wine just feet away. But here's where things get truly bizarre. Sometimes being in prison was preferable. For real. During war or famine, peasants would commit small crimes on purpose to get arrested. One winter, a man in England was caught stealing a goose, only to confess he did it hoping for a warm jail cell and regular gruel, which, to be fair, sounds marginally better than freezing to death in a thatched hut with no roof. Still, There was no guarantee you'd survive the wait. Disease ran rampant. Lice, dysentery, and medieval hygiene read no hygiene meant that many prisoners died before their trial date, and if you were poor, forget about legal representation, or mercy, or really anyone remembering your name. There's still a faint academic debate over whether medieval prisons were intended to be this horrible, or if it was just the result of, well, medieval infrastructure. Some scholars argue that cities genuinely tried to keep order, but lacked the means to do it humanely. Others say the brutality was on purpose, to terrify everyone else into obedience. And yet, even in this mudslick purgatory, there are strange little human moments. A woman hums to herself. A boy carves initials into a stone wall with a spoon. Two men argue softly about whether the king is really dead or just pretending. You step closer to the edge of the pit and look down. Someone stares back, blank-faced, hollow-eyed. His hand slowly lifts in a half wave, not quite sure if he's greeting you or asking for help. The guards ignore him. The townsfolk pass by without a glance, because once you're in the pit, you're part of the background noise, another nameless body, caught in the slow gears of a system that has no interest in your comfort or your future. So you keep walking, but the smell follows. Your shoes squelch a bit as you leave the prison behind. The earth still sticky from last night's rain, or more disturbingly, something else. You need fresh air, but as you wander toward the edge of the village, what you find is fire. Not a comforting campfire, not a crackling hearth, a bonfire roaring in a stone ring, with two stern-looking officials on either side and a pile of very unlucky books about to meet their end. You've stumbled onto a punishment for a different kind of crime, heresy. And unlike petty theft or ale-fueled brawls, this one wasn't just about laws, it was about souls. Heresy meant disagreeing with the church, and in the Middle Ages, that wasn't just bad manners. It was treason against heaven. You could get in trouble for owning the wrong book, saying the wrong prayer, or even having a dream that involved too much individual thought. And once the church got involved, things stopped making sense very quickly. The church didn't like dissent. It really didn't. And it had its own court system to deal with it, the infamous Inquisition. Depending on the century and region, you might face a bishop's tribunal, a traveling inquisitor, or a swarm of very well-fed monks with very sharp questions. And don't expect fairness. This was less trial and more trapdoor. Here's how it worked. Someone, maybe a neighbor, maybe a rival, accuses you of heresy. You don't know when. You don't know why. Suddenly, you're pulled in for questioning. There's no lawyer, no witness list. Just you, a scribe, and a man in robes asking, "Are you now or have you ever been wrong about God?" And yes, they could use torture to get the answer they wanted. One mainstream record from 13th century France describes a suspect being shown the rack, while monks quietly reminded him that confession brought peace. It's hard to feel theological clarity when your elbows are traveling in different directions. Here's the kicker. Confessing didn't guarantee leniency. If you admitted your guilt, you might be sentenced to wear a yellow cross, or walk barefoot to a shrine, or go on a permanent pilgrimage, which, by the way, was medieval for, "We hope you die on the way to Rome." If you didn't confess, well, let's just say that woodpile wasn't for warmth. A lesser-known fact, not all heretics were accused of bizarre beliefs. Some were just too enthusiastic about religion. Movements like the Cathars and Waldensians didn't reject faith. They just had the audacity to read scripture in their own language. In some places, that was enough to get you torched. One Cathar leader, Marguerite Porret, wrote a mystical book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. The church found it too philosophical. So they burned the book, then burned her, just to be safe. Scholars still debate how much of the heresy crackdown was theological panic and how much was political control. After all, heretics often challenged wealth, hierarchy, and corruption, all things the powerful weren't keen to give up. Was this about God, or about keeping the bishops in nice hats? And here's something truly strange. Some people welcome the punishment. In fringe writings, you'll find stories of mystics who saw fire as purifying, even holy. They faced death not with fear, but with eerie serenity, chanting psalms as the flames climbed their robes. You edge away from the fire as the officials drop a bundle of parchments into the blaze. The pages curl and blacken, ancient words lifting into the smoke. No screams today, just silence, except for the crackling of lost knowledge. Nearby, a priest blesses the flames. A child watches, clutching a doll, and someone mutters, "Better the book than the man." But that's the thing. It never stops at the book. You step back from the bonfire, but the scent of scorched parchment and something eerily sweet clings to your cloak. A bitter reminder that justice here isn't always about fairness. It's about control. Still, at least heresy involves ideas. What you see next? It involves animals. Again. Yes, it's time for the second round of medieval legal absurdity starring your favorite four-legged offenders. Only this time, they're not in the dock. They're on trial in full-blown court proceedings. You turn a corner and there it is. A makeshift courthouse assembled in the town square. A long table, a solemn judge, and sitting proudly in the defendant's box, a pig. Again. This one slightly fatter, wearing what might be a bonnet if your eyes aren't playing tricks on you. Animal trials were not a one-off curiosity. They were a consistent, if baffling, part of medieval legal life, especially in France, Italy, and parts of Switzerland. Pigs were the most common offenders, mostly for infanticide, which raises all kinds of uncomfortable questions about childcare in barns. But other creatures got their day in court too. Dogs, goats, cows, even a rooster once accused of laying an egg. We'll get to that one. This was not symbolic. These were full legal proceedings. A judge, a clerk, sometimes even a defense lawyer assigned specifically to the animal. The mainstream historical record confirms that in 1457, a pig in Savigny, France, was dressed in a waistcoat and hanged after being convicted of murdering a child. Her piglets were also tried as accomplices, but ultimately acquitted. Acquitted, as in, not guilty, Your Honor. The absurdity writes itself. Why did this happen? Well, part of it goes back to the medieval idea that animals, as part of God's creation, could be held morally accountable. There was a blurry line between justice, theology, and superstition. If a pig committed a sin, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a spiritual crisis. But things get even weirder. Sometimes the church tried animals, and not just livestock, insects. That's right. Locusts, beetles, mice. These were summoned to court for damaging crops. A group of rats in 16th century France were once defended by a human lawyer who argued they couldn't attend court because the roads were dangerous. Due to cats. It actually worked. The case was dismissed. The rats won. Scholars today argue over whether these trials were serious or theatrical. Some say they were symbolic rituals designed to reassure terrified villagers after natural disasters or plagues. Others suggest they reflect a deep-rooted belief in cosmic order, that justice must be served, even if the offender has a tail and no concept of property law. Still, you can't help but wonder, were people genuinely expecting pigs to understand court protocol? To cross-examine a witness? To plead remorse? A fringe theory suggests that some of these trials weren't really about animals at all. They were about blame. After all, it's easier to point at a pig than ask why a child was left alone in the mud. Easier to curse a rooster than question your local priest's Latin mumblings. Maybe the law needed scapegoats, literal ones. And yes, about that rooster. In 1474, in Basel, Switzerland, a cockerel was tried and executed for allegedly laying an egg. Authorities feared it was the work of the devil, since rooster eggs were supposedly used in dark magic. The egg, sadly, was not preserved. The rooster was not given a second opinion. You watch as the judge dramatically reads from a scroll. The pig yawns. A clerk jots something down with a quill. 2 children giggle until their mother hushes them, whispering that this is a serious matter. It's all deadly serious. Until it's not. You step away, wondering how much of justice is real and how much is theater. Are these trials meant to restore order, or just keep people too busy laughing to revolt? Because in a world this chaotic, sometimes it's easier to judge the pig than the people who raised it. You're starting to lose track of time. Sun filtered through soot, bells chiming for something vague in the distance, and then, as if summoned by the absurdity you've just witnessed, you hear it. A horn. Not musical, not ceremonial. It's urgent, sharp, and slightly off-key. It's the town crier, and behind him, a procession of men banging pots, clanking sticks, and hoisting banners that look like someone's laundry caught in a windstorm. What's happening? You, dear sleeper, have wandered into the strange and legally sanctioned world of Charivari, a kind of public protest masquerading as a medieval party. Think mob justice, but with rhythm. Charivari was a custom where people, usually neighbors, publicly mocked and humiliated someone who had broken social norms. Did an old man marry a much younger woman? Charivari. Did a woman hit her husband in public? Charivari. Did you marry too quickly after your last spouse mysteriously fell down a well? Charivari Deluxe, complete with cowbells. The idea was to shame people into conformity without necessarily going through formal courts. It wasn't illegal, but it definitely wasn't subtle. Mainstream historians have traced Charivari traditions across France, Germany, and England, especially from the 12th to 17th centuries. It was part public discipline, part neighborhood purge, and a whole lot of unlicensed percussion. Tonight's target appears to be a man accused of marrying out of station, a common offense if you were a lowly cooper daring to wed a baker's daughter. You see him now, slumped against his front door, eyes closed, as the crowd clatters by. The young boy wears a mock version of the man's hat and trails a rope with a chicken tied to it. You don't ask. The law didn't always intervene in Charivaris. In fact, local authorities sometimes joined in. It saved them the trouble of dealing with the actual dispute. Why go through the hassle of evidence and testimony when you can just let the townsfolk rattle pans until everyone behaves? But Charivaris could turn nasty. Fringe accounts describe beatings, property damage, even forced exile. One case in 14th century Rouen involved a man who married a widow too soon after her husband's death. They were both stripped, paraded on donkeys, and pelted with flour and dead mice. It sounds absurd until you realize this was the justice system at work. The people were the gavel now. Not everyone agreed it was effective. There's a scholarly debate about whether Charivari was genuinely a tool of community cohesion or just an excuse for collective bullying. Some historians view it as a necessary valve for public frustration in rigid societies. Others argue it disproportionately targeted women, widows, and anyone already outside the local power structure. In a strange twist, church authorities sometimes condemned Charivaris, only to host their own versions. Religious parades that ridiculed heretics or corrected immoral behavior with public prayers, whipped flagellants, and long sermons. So, basically a sanctified Charivari with incense. You wander through the crowd, the noise vibrating through your ribs. Someone offers you a pot to bang. You decline. Too sleepy for mob rule tonight. The procession turns into a kind of grotesque conga line. They pass the newlyweds' house 3 times, singing a nonsense rhyme about crooked feet and mismatched shoes. Then, just like that, it's over. The clanging stops. The people vanish. The man remains, staring at the ground. No law was officially broken, no court verdict. But in the village ledger of things that must not be done, a new warning has been scribbled, loud and off-key. You walk on, ears ringing, half laughing and half wincing, because in this strange system, the courtroom isn't always a room. Sometimes it's the street, and your jury, everyone you've ever borrowed flour from. You follow the last echo of clanging pans until it fades into the chatter of a marketplace, not the cheerful sort with colorful fruit stalls and velvet merchants. No, this one's grimy. Carts lean sideways. A goat appears to be chewing someone's sock. A man in a corner hawks something he claims is cure for everything but death. You don't ask what's in it, but something's off. A woman is standing on a platform, arms bound, not quite flinching as the town constable reads a charge aloud. She's been branded. You can see the raw red T on her collarbone. Short for thief, obviously, or sometimes traitor. Branding was wonderfully versatile like that. This, dear listener, is your introduction to the world of permanent punishment. Because when medieval law wasn't busy hanging you, flogging you, or publicly mocking your marriage choices, it loved nothing more than marking you forever. Branding, maiming, scarring. These weren't side effects. They were the point. The punishment was the memory of the punishment, carried with you wherever you went. Not unlike that tattoo you regret from spring break. Except everyone stares at it and assumes you're dangerous. Mainstream legal historians confirm that branding was often used in place of execution, seen as merciful. Mercy here meaning we won't kill you, but everyone you meet for the rest of your life will know exactly what you did. First-time offenders might get a single letter. Repeat offenders? You could collect the whole alphabet. One man in 14th century England reportedly had an F for felony and an R for robbery, though some scholars argue the R may have stood for rebel. No one bothered to ask him. And let's talk maiming. If you were caught forging coins, lose a hand, a burglar, say goodbye to a few fingers. Adultery, hope you weren't fond of your ears. There's a fringe account of a baker whose kneecaps were broken for watering down dough, technically a fraud case, but it seems excessive for carbs. Now, were these punishments common? That's where historians get twitchy. Some argue the written laws were more dramatic than the real ones. Courts could order a nose sliced off or a hand removed, but they might settle for a fine or public shaming. After all, amputating someone creates a dependent, and in a world with zero disability benefits, that was a burden nobody wanted to feed. Still, the threat mattered. People remembered the one guy who lost a hand, even if he was one of 100 sentenced. The fear of it was enough to keep most folks from stealing that second chicken. And then there's the scold's bridle, a metal cage clamped over the head, with a tongue press inside to prevent speech, reserved for quarrelsome women, gossips, or, let's be honest, anyone who spoke too much. The device made sure you couldn't talk without cutting your mouth. It was part punishment, part medieval noise control. Some towns had variations. Masks shaped like animal heads, bells attached to call attention to your shame, or iron collars that read things like blasphemer or idle drunk. You wore it, walked through town, and hoped no one recognized you. Spoiler, they always did. There's an open scholarly debate over whether these punishments were about deterrence or spectacle. Were they truly meant to reform the individual, or just scare the crowd into staying in line? Likely both. Justice was a stage. You were the warning. The branded woman steps down now, trying to pull her shawl higher to cover the mark. But the crowd's already murmuring. Children whisper. A vendor pretends not to see her. She's been judged, punished, and marked. Done, as far as the law is concerned. But her sentence is just beginning. And you wonder, what's worse? The pain, or never being allowed to leave it behind? You move on, heart a little heavier. Because in this system, forgiveness isn't written. It's etched in skin. You walk quietly now, each step echoing a little louder in your mind than on the dirt path below. The crowd fades behind you, but you can't shake the image of that woman's branded collarbone, how it glowed angry red, like a warning beacon no one could turn off. Eventually, you find yourself at a low stone bridge arched over a river that smells, generously, like old soup. There's a figure there, robed, hooded, holding a thick roll of parchment and a small wooden box. You've arrived at the next baffling chapter of medieval law, trial by ordeal. Yes, we've reached that part, the part where truth is not discovered through evidence or reasoned debate, but through fire, water, and occasionally cheese. Here's how it worked. You were accused of a crime, maybe theft, maybe sorcery, maybe talking back to someone in a fancier hat. There weren't enough witnesses. There wasn't a clear verdict. So the court turned to God. And because God wasn't known for showing up to testify, they decided he'd reveal the truth through pain. Let's start with the ordeal by hot iron. This one's a classic. The accused would carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces, then have their wounds wrapped up and left for a few days. If the burns festered, guilty. If they healed cleanly, innocent. Because obviously, biology was just divine commentary. Then there was the ordeal by water. This one's a little confusing. You'd be bound and dropped into a pool of holy water. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. Why? Because the water, being pure, would reject the guilty by keeping them afloat. Scholars still argue whether people tried to sink on purpose. Fringe accounts suggest some held rocks in their mouths. And don't forget the ordeal of the morsel, usually for clergy. You'd swallow a piece of dry bread or cheese while reciting a prayer. If you choked or turned blue, guilt. If you survived the snack, innocence. Essentially, a deadly potluck. One mainstream example. In 11th century England, Queen Emma, yes, a queen, was accused of treason and forced to walk barefoot over 9 red-hot plowshares to prove her innocence. She passed. Miraculously, they said. Skeptics today suspect the irons may have cooled mysteriously before the walk. The church eventually grew uneasy with these trials. By the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council banned clergy from blessing the implements. Without divine backing, the ordeals lost some credibility, though not enough to disappear entirely. Some towns kept them going unofficially, like a carnival ride no one wanted to admit was shut down. There's debate among historians about whether people actually believed in these ordeals. Some argue they were psychological traps, meant to scare people into confessing. Others believe communities genuinely saw them as divine judgment. After all, in a world where illness was caused by demons and commas predicted war, burning your hand for justice felt normal-ish. And sometimes the ordeal worked backward. A person might pass the test and still be punished, just in case. Because nothing says fair trial like passing and failing simultaneously. The robed man unrolls his parchment and reads something solemn as a woman steps forward. She's trembling. Her wrists are being tied. She glances at the river, then at the crowd forming behind you. You don't stay. You don't want to see how the water votes today. Instead, you wander on. The logic of it all folding in on itself like one of those wooden puzzle boxes you never quite open. Because in a world where God was judge, jury, and hydrologist, your fate might depend on whether your burns got infected or whether you could swallow without coughing. You keep walking down a path that smells faintly of wood smoke and wet leather. The trees thin out, and suddenly you're standing at the edge of a clearing. A gallows, still, silent, except for the creak of a rope in the breeze. You've arrived at the most final, and yet somehow still baffling, part of medieval justice: execution. Now, you'd think that once someone was dead, the legal system would consider the matter closed. But no. Medieval courts had a curious habit of trying people after death, as in dragging corpses to court, dressing them up, reading charges aloud, and then, believe it or not, sentencing them. One of the most infamous cases, Pope Formosus, died in 896. 9 months later, he was dug up, dressed in papal robes, propped on a throne, and put on trial in what became known as the Cadaver Synod. His dead body was literally interrogated. A deacon answered on his behalf. Shockingly, he was found guilty. They stripped him of his holy garments, cut off the fingers he'd used to bless people, and threw his body in the Tiber River. You can't make this up, though you kind of wish someone had. Why do this? Scholars still debate. Some say it was political theater, designed to erase his influence and humiliate his supporters. Others argue it was about purging corruption retroactively, as if justice could reach across the grave and tidy things up. Either way, the logic is, let's say, flexible. And Formosus wasn't the only one. Dead nobles were sometimes exhumed to be officially declared traitors, their property seized, and their memory damned. It was like cancel culture with more worms. One man in Bohemia was posthumously tried for heresy. His corpse was burned on the assumption that improper burial might mess with the afterlife's seating chart. But the posthumous weirdness wasn't just legal. It could be punitive. You've likely heard of being drawn and quartered. But did you know some towns would keep parts of the body as a civic warning? A head on a spike at the gate, a hand nailed to a door, sometimes even bones boiled and displayed. Not for science, for symbolism. Then there were the animals again. Yes, again. In some towns, dead pigs were tried and executed for having killed a person, even if the pig was already slain on the spot. One fringe case suggests a farmer's ox was retroactively tried, found guilty, and ordered to be buried with dishonor, as if oxen had pride. The pageantry of medieval executions is hard to ignore. Gallows were often placed in high-traffic areas, on hills near crossroads, by rivers, where they'd be visible for miles. The message was clear: crime doesn't pay, and it definitely doesn't get a respectful burial. Gallows humor was quite literal back then. Executioners had strange legal roles too. They were feared, needed, and socially ostracized. In some cities, executioners weren't allowed to live within the main town walls. In others, they got first pick of the dead person's clothes, and sometimes a chicken as a bonus. One odd custom in Bavaria even allowed the executioner to operate a public bathhouse, because apparently nothing says relaxation like a nice soak run by the guy who just beheaded your neighbor. And yes, there's a scholarly debate about how public executions shaped medieval law. Some argue they were designed for deterrence, shock, and the reinforcement of divine justice. Others suggest they became entertainment, social gatherings where the drama distracted from daily misery. Some towns even sold snacks. You pass beneath a wooden arch, ducking instinctively beneath the frayed end of a dangling rope. There's no one here now, just birds, and the memory of laws that believe justice didn't stop at the end of your breath. You wonder, not for the first time tonight, whether these people feared death more or the indignities that came after. You leave the gallows behind with that peculiar heaviness in your step, the kind that comes from realizing even death wasn't a guaranteed escape clause. Just a new kind of court date, really. The path twists, descending toward a squat gray building that looks like it was designed to keep people inside. No windows, just slits. A single iron-banded door with a latch that groans like an old man when it opens. Welcome to the medieval jail, a word just as uncomfortable as the rooms it describes. Contrary to modern expectations, prisons in the Middle Ages weren't usually punishment. They were more like storage lockers for humans. You didn't get sentenced to prison. You got held in prison until your real punishment was ready. Torture, execution, public shaming. Those were the finales. Jail was the waiting room, without the magazines. You step inside. The air hits you like wet wool. Dark, damp, thick with a musty staleness that smells suspiciously like cabbage and despair. Rats don't even scurry. They saunter like they've paid rent, and the people inside, shackled to walls, covered in straw and silence, eyes like flickering candles. In some cities, prisoners had to pay for their stay. You heard that right. A fee for chains, stale bread, and one toilet bucket shared by everyone. No money, no food. Want out early? Bribe the jailer. This wasn't justice. It was a business model with manacles. Mainstream historians confirmed that jails were often privately managed. Jailers bought their position and made money through fees, extortion, and sometimes selling bed space. Fringe reports describe jailers renting out better sleeping spots to wealthier prisoners, or worse, using the poor as unpaid labor to clean up the mess from executions. One recorded case from 13th century London involved a man locked up for unpaid taxes who actually died in prison before his trial because he couldn't afford food. Justice, it seems, had a cover charge. There's a debate among scholars over whether jails contributed anything meaningful to public order or simply punished poverty and misfortune. Some argue they became informal holding zones for the mentally ill, religious dissenters, and unlucky debtors. Others note that jails were often overfilled, underfunded, and mostly ignored, until a breakout happened or someone famous died in one. Torture chambers were often adjacent, though not always in use. Contrary to popular myth, medieval torture wasn't a constant. It was usually restricted by law, but exceptions abounded. Enhanced questioning by hot tongs, water drips, or something called the pear of anguish, which you absolutely don't want to picture. And still, there were jails that functioned as minor cities within cities. Some long-term prisoners created communities, sharing food, carving out social roles, even forming underground trade systems. It wasn't justice. It was survival with chains. You step deeper, your eyes adjusting to the dark. Someone is singing softly. Not a sad tune, surprisingly. Just a lullaby. Perhaps to themselves. Perhaps to no one. In one corner, you spot a plaque etched into the wall. Do not forget who put you here. Whether that means the judge, the king, or simply bad luck. Hard to say. You back out slowly, blinking as the outside air hits you. Freedom tastes like manure and chimney soot, but it's better than mildew. You're beginning to see the strange logic of it all. Medieval law wasn't about rehabilitation. It wasn't even always about guilt. It was about control, order, in a world with too many unknowns. Better to lock you up while they figured it out, or more often, while they forgot about you completely. You glance back once at the heavy door. It thuds shut behind you, and you're grateful for air, for motion, and for not being someone the system misplaced. You rub your arms as you walk, still feeling the chill from that prison air. The road ahead narrows, winding through a sleepy village where chickens strut like they own real estate. But you're not here for poultry. Your eye catches a faded wooden sign swinging above a doorway. It reads, The Court of Pie Powder. You stop, squint. Pie powder? Surely not a medieval dessert court? But it's not about food at all, though you kind of wish it were. Pie powder comes from the French pieds poudrés, meaning dusty feet. It refers to travelers and merchants at fairs. These were temporary courts, set up for trade fairs to settle disputes quickly. Right there in the middle of the marketplace. Someone sells a rotten fish, someone pockets your coin, boom. Drag them to the pie powder court. You peek inside. A single judge sits on a bench made of barrels. There's a scroll on the wall outlining the rules. Swift justice, same-day verdict, appeal by tomorrow. It's kind of like Judge Judy, but with fewer teeth and more goats. Here, in these dusty fairgrounds, justice had to be fast. Trade fairs were temporary. If someone cheated you, they could vanish into the next town by sundown. So these courts had the power to try, sentence, and even punish all in the same day. And yes, mainstream historians agree they were surprisingly efficient. While the royal courts could drag on for months or decades, the pie powder courts were over in hours. A few witnesses, some cross-talking, a muddy coin for evidence, and the judge would pronounce a fine or some mild punishment. Stocks, maybe. The idea was less about vengeance and more about keeping trade peaceful. You watch as a vendor accuses another of selling watered-down ale. A third interrupts, saying he saw rats in the keg. The judge sighs and gestures for all three to approach, muttering something about this being the third rat case today. It's oddly bureaucratic, and somehow comforting. Fringe reports tell of traveling judges with wagons full of scrolls, and miniature benches, and sometimes their own portable stocks. Imagine carrying your office cubicle around just to publicly shame someone selling fake saffron. But pie powder courts weren't the only weird legal niches. There were manorial courts, where lords acted as judge over their tenants, usually involving pigs in gardens or who stole whose turnips. Then there were church courts, dealing with sins and spiritual crimes, like failing to attend mass or engaging in, let's call it, unlicensed courtship. If you were caught gossiping or skipping confession, you might be sentenced to do penance, sometimes in public, wearing nothing but a sheet and a guilty face. These courts operated on different rules, overlapping jurisdictions, and a lot of who-you-know favoritism. One person might face royal law, another church law, and a third manorial law, all for similar offenses. Scholars still scratch their heads over how this tangled mess functioned at all, and it gets messier. In some towns, if you fled into a sanctuary, like a church, you could claim 40 days of legal protection. That's right, even if you were guilty, the law couldn't touch you inside. If you lasted the full 40 days, you had two options: face trial or agree to permanent exile. You confess, swear to leave the kingdom, and be escorted to a port with a white cross on your shoulder like some medieval penalty flag. You glance back at the pie powder court as another case closes. A sack of onions changes hands. Someone is ordered to sweep pig dung from the ale path as punishment. Justice served. Oddly, these little courts may have been the most functional part of the system. They were local. They were quick. They fit the rhythm of daily life. In a way, they worked better than all those flaming irons and nose removal policies combined. You walk on, the sounds of fairground justice fading behind you, and for once the laws make a sliver of sense. Not a big one, but enough to make you smile. The road quiets now, and your boots scuff softly against packed earth as twilight drapes itself gently over the countryside. Somewhere behind you, a bell tolls, slow and low, like the closing of a book you never quite understood. You've wandered through royal courts, muddy fairgrounds, prison halls, and nose-severing punishments. And now, you're nearing the edge of it all. You crest a hill. Below, a monastery curls like a stone snake beside a winding stream. It's serene, peaceful. You pause a moment, breathing in the mossy stillness, because now we come to the last, and maybe strangest, layer of medieval law. Sanctuary and legal loopholes so absurd they might actually work. The concept of sanctuary was simple on the surface. If you were accused of a crime and you reached a church before they caught you, the law had to stop at the door. The moment you crossed the threshold, boom, you were under divine protection. Even if you had, say, axed a baker in broad daylight, for 40 days you could remain untouched. The church fed you, sheltered you, and gave you time to decide. You could stand trial, or confess and abjure the realm, a fancy phrase meaning you'd be banished for life, literally forced to walk to a port and leave the kingdom, never to return. This, scholars say, created a bizarre population of roaming, confession-stamped exiles, wandering like human clerical errors. But the loopholes? Oh, they get better. One involved benefit of clergy. This was originally a rule saying that clergy members couldn't be tried in secular courts. Over time, this privilege extended to anyone who could read, as in, if you could read a Bible passage, you got a more lenient trial under church law. Naturally, this led to what's called the neck verse, a specific line of Psalm 51 that people memorize just in case. Pretend to read it? Congratulations. You are now temporarily clergy. The penalty for first-time murder might be a short penance instead of hanging. Not kidding. Another workaround? Trial by compurgation. You'd bring in a dozen friends, your oath helpers, who would swear you couldn't possibly have done the crime. These folks didn't have to prove anything. They just had to swear you were a stand-up person. If they spoke with confidence, that was enough. Because obviously, friends are completely unbiased when your neck's on the line. Mainstream historical records show that compurgation was used for everything from property disputes to accusations of theft. Eventually, it fell out of favor, especially when it became clear that people, well, lied. And then there were the weirdly conditional sentences. One man convicted of thievery in Yorkshire was sentenced to have his hand cut off only if he was caught stealing again. Basically, a legally binding pinky promise. Another law required a guilty man to build a bridge as penance. No deadline, no oversight. Just go make a bridge. Scholars still wonder if that bridge ever happened. And don't forget the tolling bell. If someone ran toward a church while a bell was tolling for service, they were legally allowed to claim sanctuary, even if they technically hadn't crossed the threshold yet. Imagine guards skidding to a stop at the sound of a bell. Ah, blast! Sanctuary in progress! Some fringe theories suggest that clever criminals manipulated festival days, overlapping jurisdictions, or even faked religious vows to escape harsh sentences. One tale tells of a man who became a monk for exactly 7 days, long enough to avoid trial, then quietly disappeared. You pause near the monastery gate, fingers grazing the stone. You imagine being one of those fugitives, breathing hard, heart pounding, hoping that this place, this building of faith and loopholes, might just save your life, even if just for 40 days. So now, with moonlight washing over the old road and the distant howl of a wolf, likely chasing an unlucky pig lawyer, you finally understand. Medieval law didn't make sense because it wasn't really built to make sense. It was patchwork, superstition, desperation, and the occasional loophole-shaped miracle. And somehow, it worked. Sort of. You sit now, legs tucked beneath you, the night cool and quiet around your shoulders. The fire in the monastery flickers faintly behind stained glass. The road has gone still. The chaos of medieval law, the absurdity, the blood, the surprising warmth in dusty courts, fades gently like candle smoke rising toward beams long untouched by light. And though it made little sense, somehow it held things together. Towns still turned, crops still grew, and people still laughed, between the branding and the bribery. You let your breath slow, let your shoulders melt into the weightless dark. No more trials tonight, no more oaths or pigs in wigs, just the hush of a world half remembered, half invented, and altogether too strange to forget. The wind nudges the door open just a hair, then closes it softly, like the last page of a bedtime story. Rest easy. You won't be summoned to court tonight. No stocks, no gallows, no nose tax, just sleep.